Welcome to the Fighter Pilot Professor. I am your host, Meta. Glad you're here. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about the end of the Vietnam War. And no, I'm not talking about the American part of the Vietnam War. And we'll also be talking a little bit about the comparison trap. You know, what does success look like for you? As always, hit like, follow me on Instagram and YouTube, the Fighter Pilot Professor, and share it with your friends so they can hit like and follow me. And then they can share it with their friends. We'll dive right in. Welcome to the Fighter Pilot Professor podcast. I'm your host, Meta. And in the Fighter Pilot Professor podcast, every week we examine world events and your daily life through the mind of a fighter pilot. The episodes answer your questions, harnessing my experience in 25 years of flying fighter jets and my PhD in history, policy, and strategy. You can tune in wherever you find your favorite podcast. You can follow me on Instagram and on YouTube, the Fighter Pilot Professor. So this year marks the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon. So in April of 1975, the North Vietnamese Army captured the city of Saigon, effectively ending the Vietnam War and ending the split of North Vietnam and South Vietnam into two nations. And this is really just the end of about 30 years of fighting for the Vietnamese people. So in the wake of World War II, Ho Chi Minh declared North Vietnam to be a communist state independent from France, and the French did not agree with that. And that began a low-level guerrilla war, which then escalated, and eventually the French left South Vietnam as an independent nation, agreed upon largely in an arranged agreement between the U.S., the Soviets, Vietnamese. That divided Vietnam and North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And of course just further brought the United States into the conflict. And for the better part of the 1960s, of course, the United States was involved in trying to support South Vietnam as an independent nation. The United States signed the Paris Accords with North Vietnam in 1973, which ended U.S. involvement in South Vietnam. And then over the course of the next 2 years, the North Vietnamese effectively sort of began a creeping assault into South Vietnam. And in March of 1975, they launched a full-on military assault into the remnant of South Vietnam and seized the majority of it. The collapse was fairly rapid. By the assault, the offensive, the North Vietnamese offensive began at the beginning of March, and by the end of April, it was all over. And the U.S. Embassy was famously evacuated, and that effectively signaled the end of the war between the two Vietnamese states. What's noteworthy here is that we in America tend to sort of focus on the U.S. portion of the Vietnam War, and we sort of disregard the beginnings and the ends of what happens there. And so, you know, the 2 years of war that takes place after the U.S. pulls out, and the effectively decade or so of war that takes place before the U.S. becomes officially involved, is really, you know, as impactful on what the outcome of the war is as the parts where the United States is involved. And arguably, you know, you can draw a lot of parallels to the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan, where there are, you know, is a decade worth of fighting that happens prior to the U.S. Entering in 2001, and then obviously the Afghan government collapses in about the same time span, in that sort of 1-2 month long period at the end of the U.S. involvement. The difference here is, though, that the North Vietnamese, beginning in 1972, before the United States left, the North Vietnamese had been steadily sort of assaulting South Vietnam, and they, in the spring of 1972, they put forward what's called the Easter Offensive, a large conventional forced offensive, which was one of the few that they did. The 1968 Tet Offensive was famously a large conventional force assault by the North Vietnamese, along with unconventional forces. But the 72 and 73 offensives are almost exclusively regular North Vietnamese army. And that capability had taken them, the better part of a decade to build up the armor and infantry and all that kind of stuff. And in the 1972 version of the offensive, it was really U.S. air power that managed to save the day, or at least to shore up the South Vietnamese forces enough that it paused the assault. In 1973, of course, that was not the case, and the U.S. had left the country. And secretly, as Nixon was wanting to do, Nixon had promised the South Vietnamese that, should we be needed, the Americans would happily come back and help, hold off any North Vietnamese assaults. One of the critical things, besides sort of general chaos in the South Vietnamese government, was in 1973, Nixon was, of course, in trouble for what went on in the Watergate Hotel, which eventually led to his resignation. So with the turmoil in the U.S. government and Nixon's resignation, then that really left nobody that was willing to advocate for U.S. involvement. I have doubts that Nixon would have advocated for U.S. involvement anyways, but nevertheless, the United States was unwilling to get involved, and that just hastened the demise of the South Vietnamese, much like it did in Afghanistan for most recent times. The interesting part, I think, though, is now the U.S. and Vietnam are sort of moving towards each other. I don't know that we would call us totally friends yet, but we're moving towards each other in sort of a mutual distrust of Chinese expansionist activity in Chinese influence in Southeast Asia. So I find it interesting that, after decades of war and effectively decades of estrangement, the U.S. and Vietnam are now sort of coming closer together around what was, traditionally in Vietnamese history, one of the bigger influences in Vietnam, which is China. So there you go. That's the end of the Vietnam War. We'll have more interesting anniversaries coming up in a few episodes ahead. As always, hit like and follow, and tell your friends about me. All right, so recently I've seen, I follow, unsurprisingly, I guess probably, I follow a lot of those sort of motivational video type things on social media, and recently I saw a string of them on different platforms talking about the sort of what goes on behind the scenes of success. And we've talked about this a little bit, getting out there and grinding and doing the things and making sacrifices for the things that you have to do. But this was a little bit different take on it. And I really like this idea of when you achieve success, that's really most what everybody sees, right? They only see the successful part. The parts that make success, the hard work, that nobody really ever sees that, right? That goes on in the background. And so, as you are doing whatever it is that you're doing, or trying to do whatever it is that you're trying to do, and trying to achieve and striving to better yourself or whatever, a lot of times we tend to look out at other people and go, oh, look how successful they are. They've been able to do all of these things, and they've just done it, like overnight success. And I don't feel like that's really true. I think that we just don't see the part that is ugly. We often don't even see the failures or frankly, we tend not to pay attention to other people's failures. We tend to look at our own very, 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 very closely. But we tend to sort of gloss over like, oh, that's just what happens, when you compete or whatever. And we just look at all of the good things. Michael Jordan famously talked about all the shots that he's missed and all the games that he's lost and all those things. And it's true, right? Like, he's missed thousands of shots and he lost hundreds of games. And yet, right, we only look at the success that he had. And you could say the same thing for anybody that is successful. And so what I think happens is we tend to get in our heads a little bit about what success and failure looks like and how it should go and how it should be. And we very, very self-critically go, man, I shouldn't have to work this hard, or man, I shouldn't have this many failures on my way to success. And that doesn't really jive with reality, right? That doesn't really jive with how things really work. In my opinion, right, we just don't see what happens. We don't see everybody else's hard work that goes into it. So, the moral of the story here, of course, is don't sweat it, right? Like, don't sweat what other people's success looks like and how long it takes you or doesn't take you or how many times you try and fail before you reach your success. It will come eventually, right? If you're willing to persevere, realistically persevere, I should say, maybe. But don't fall into that comparison trap. Don't look out there and say, hey, look, the so-and-so is doing this and they're so successful. You're not seeing what struggles they're going through, right? So don't judge your success based on other people's success. There you go. Hope you enjoyed. As always, share the episode around. Tell your friends. Hit like, follow, post it up on the socials, as it were. You can follow me on Instagram and YouTube, The Fighter Pilot Professor. And as always, get your podcasts wherever you get your podcasts. Have a good one.